Hi, this is Amy Furman. I'm a music educator and music therapist with the Minneapolis Public Schools. Today we're going to be talking about strategies for success in the inclusive music classroom. Now, I usually like to have this be a very hands-on and have you experience some of the things that I'm going to be talking about. That's much harder in this format. So I'm going to do my very best to have this be as meaningful and as functional as possible for you by having looked at the teacher feedback comments and what people thought were most helpful in previous workshops I've done for music educators. So we're going to take a 2-second look at historical background, review universal design for learning, and then talk about strategies for the music classroom, a prompt hierarchy to support independent participation, and then working with one of your greatest resources, which is the special education assistants that often accompany children who are being included in the music education setting. So there's a wealth of information around historical background, around equity for students' participation in education. And that's about all I can say in the time frame I have, but there's a wealth of important information that drives our education system today that we're built upon. And so looking at most recently the Every Student Succeeds Act signed in 2015 by President Obama, it really says that every child deserves a well-rounded education and puts music and the arts right in there under protected time. Bottom line, every child deserves a free and appropriate education in the least restrictive environment that includes music and the arts. So we want to do our very best for those students. There's a lot of talk around people first language or identity first language, and it simply means thinking about individuals first. And some people prefer identity first language, other people first language. What you're missing in the cartoon there, sorry, is simply ask the person. But it means we have to be cognizant and think about using inclusive words and making sure if we're making a reference, it really includes everyone in our class. So I'm very careful if I'm going to talk about somebody's home. That's a word I use. A lot of students don't live in a house. They might be in an apartment. They might be in a trailer. They might be in a shelter. Home is where you're currently living. And again, offering, if you're going to use an example of a holiday, then you need to be inclusive and you need to be sure you're mentioning all the holidays that might be celebrated by the students that you're working with. So there's some common sort of people first languages just to help us be aware of what we're saying. I think one of the things that makes me realize how different language can be is saying accessible parking as opposed to handicap parking. That just puts a whole different concept around that need. Universal design grew out of architecture and saying, how can what we design be available and functional for everyone? And I like this aspect. Yes, you can adapt things and make them work, but boy, if you design right from the beginning to include everyone, what a difference. And so when we're doing our lesson planning, we want to design and think about the levels and the scaffolding and the opportunity right from the beginning. Because if we do, we're going to be more open to the reality of, gosh, if we just designed it right and shoveled the ramp from the beginning, everyone could get into the activity or whatever we're doing. So universal design for learning, then, growing out of the architecture, says what are the ways a student can be engaged? Are there multiple ways to engage and have them involved in the activity? When you present the information, is it done across a variety of learning styles, such that you might say it, you might show a visual, you might also do it as a motor activity. Those are ways then that all students can be engaged and can learn. And in the same way, when we're asking students to demonstrate their knowledge, do we have different ways that it can be done so that the students can all succeed using what's a strength for them? And that's one of the key things I think we'll keep coming back to, is that piece of assuming competency and helping to ensure that every child gets to show their competency. So, who's in your classroom? I think it's kind of stunning when we as educators stop a minute and think about, who do we interact with in the course of the day? There are a lot of people in our lives, and I'm not talking about the students here. These are, when I sit down and think about it, who do I often interact with as a music educator? These are the people that I might interact with throughout the course of the day before we even get to the students. So take a minute and reflect on all of that, those individuals that just are part of our job. In Minnesota, we utilize federal settings to determine where students are placed. So in a federal setting, the students spend the majority of their day in a regular education classroom. That's less than 21% of the day they might go out for a special ed, like a resource room or a reading teacher or extra math time. Federal setting 2, they might be outside of the classroom 21 to 60% of the day, but they are still part of and considered part of that regular education room. It is not till more than 60% of the day needs to be in that specialized teaching that we have what we might consider a self-contained classroom. When people talk about inclusion, these are usually the students that you're talking about, the students who are in a federal setting 3 and then come in and join students for lunch or recess, often specialist time, morning meeting. And federal setting 4 then is a completely separate program. So that means when your classroom walks in, you are already dealing with students in a federal setting 1 and 2 who are part of that classroom. And I realized I, each year, take a kind of careful look at who is in my classroom, because I don't want to call on students to read when in the 4th grade, they really might have a kindergarten reading level. My solution, until I really know students, I have whole rows read. And that way, I am not singling out or accidentally calling on someone who's not going to be able to do that. This is my classroom before I added students from a self-contained classroom. And you have to consider our gifted students, because we need to make sure they're engaged in learning in all the levels. And this was a 2nd grade classroom with 21 students. And again, English language learners are a big part of the students that we're teaching. And we need to be thinking, are we being inclusive? Are we providing multiple ways of presenting the information so we're sure they know what we're talking about? Chances are you're going to have students who are on the autism spectrum disorder continuum. You will probably have a dual eligible student, and that means students who are English language learners and also receive special education setting 3 or 4 services. Now we're ready to talk about getting students into your music room. A quick reminder that the special education setting for all ages is a much smaller group with a lot more individualized attention and opportunity. And suddenly they're joining you in a kindergarten music room, where finding the teacher, keeping your eyes on the teacher, is a whole different thing. And there's just a greater demand for self-regulation, for self-control, for independence, especially as we move along the continuum and working through the grades. And what we want to make sure is that we find ways to include everyone. And there's some wonderful instruments now that are just like the professional and same. For example, you'll see 2 different sizes of ocean drums there, and you see the different sizes of maracas and cabasas. All of those things that make a big difference for including everyone in our classroom. So the first thing you want to think about is the structure of your classroom. Can wheelchairs get in and out easily so that it's not always having to have someone move. Think about that seating arrangement. When you're giving directions, we often have to be kind of literal. It's the example of, you're pulling my leg, and that's simply not going to be understood by many of our students. We know students do well with ritual and routines, and you will find that visual schedules and choices are really helpful. When I talk about that seating arrangement, often our tendency is to put someone with special needs in the front. Well, reality may be, if this is a child who's hyperactive, if they're at the back or on the side, their body can move and wiggle, but they're not going to bother anybody else, but their eyes may be on you. I also found that, especially for Native American children and some of my Hmong students, if I put them further back, they make eye contact and look at me. Too close, and it's not respectful to look at an elder and look them in the eye. And it's much easier further back. Same for my students on the autism spectrum. If I'm 12 o'clock and I had those students at, 5, 6, and 7, I fell within their eye gaze, and they didn't have to turn their head and try and find me. And they were more likely to self-correct and be part of it. All of those kinds of structures are really helpful in making your classroom be successful. Bottom line, you have to be a detective. You have to figure out what's going to work with this group. And it's much harder doing this without people to get feedback from. Representation, how you present the information. Are you doing it in multiple ways? I found for some of my students, if I started off with some rhythms and a little bit of singing before I put the words on the board, I kept everybody with me. Starting with that written text for this particular group of students tended to just shut them down or think they weren't going to be able to do it. So presenting things in those multiple ways. Do I need to customize it for this group? Is it big enough? Is it clear enough for all of my students? Do they have the background knowledge? Going back to, what does a monkey look like? Can the students access information that I've taught in the past? Having forte, loud, having those word walls available for students. All of that is part of representation and presenting the information. I have found that visuals, a technique that you use with students with autism, has turned out to be really helpful for all the students in the class. In the attachments at the end of this presentation, there's a list of 10 things that help students, English language learners. And by jingos, it's all things that you also use with students with special needs. Anyway, I have found that the visuals I was using with students with special needs really helped guide the whole classroom. And having a sense of schedule. This is a friend just kind of put this together and sent me a copy because she said, you know what? It made all the difference for the students to just kind of know what they were going to do. I often just put like little squares. We're going to do 5 different things today. I might not even lay it out, but I'm just checking it off. And it helps for those students who need a sense of, when are we going to be done, to see, oh, we're on the 3rd thing and we haven't sung goodbye yet. A lot of your students with special needs might have a visual schedule that they use throughout the day. If so, ask the teacher for a copy, have the special ed assistant, if they come with someone, you go ahead and use the same system that the student is used to in your classroom. Remember, a student's behavior is part of their communication, and that communication is part of behavior. So you have to be a detective to figure out what's being said, what's happening with this. My example for this is a student, the special ed resource teacher came to me and said, no one wants the student to be late coming to specialists. Can you let him come in 10 to 15 minutes late? And I thought, you know what? This little guy is so anxious and often comes in and seems really upset when he's first coming in. Yes, let's have him come in later. And I made him a little square so that if he came in and we were dancing, he could come stand in my parking lot which is where everyone went. If you didn't have a partner, you'd come to the parking lot, and he could watch and see what was happening. He would take the first seat, front row, so he could just walk in and sit right down and be there. Partway through the year, a group of 5 people came in to say, okay, we need to understand the only class that this young man is transitioning into and out of without difficulty is your classroom. And I said, he's really anxious. He has a lot of anxiety and has difficulty. So he comes in a little bit late and everything is already settled down. The class is going. He can see right what to do. He sits right here near the front, at the front edge. And on the back of the piano, I had a number of those different visuals. And he would look at those and say, I can handle this. I can handle this. I'm going to be calm. And he used those things I had on the back of the piano to calm himself. The other thing that I realized happened partway through is that the young man who was sitting behind him was really good at ignoring him if the child talked to himself occasionally or fidgeted. This little guy was really good at able to ignore him. And I was so impressed that I said to the young man, would you like me to send your mom a happy note, or would you like a phone call? And he said, I don't think my mom's ever gotten a happy call about me if it's really going to be happy. And by jingoes, he could ignore. And when the group stand up to line up, he would keep a buffer. In other words, he didn't bump into the child. And the other thing is when the teacher came and the students would depart, he could hear what the teacher said to do when he went back to the classroom. And he was close to his teacher. And I always let him be part of that first lineup. Everybody else I mixed up, but I let him be first because I realized he needed that little bit of structure and calm. And that's why that worked for him, and it worked for the rest of the class. So, expression. Students demonstrating understanding. Do I have different ways for them to show that they understand? Can they sing it, play it, do it, right? What kind of scaffolding have I provided as they're learning a skill? I think one of the most important things when you're working in an inclusive setting is you see something that the student has learned or done well, and then how can you use it again, or how can you take it and make it that little bit harder, but you keep pulling on the things that they have done well. And do I provide differential feedback to encourage different kinds of things? For one student, I might send him to the back and I want him to write something on the board. Because I can tell he's got piano lessons, I want him to write it. Another student, I may ask him to simply copy it, because that's where they're at. Many of the students you work with might have an alternative or augmentative communication device. This device is their voice and their way of communicating with others. And so it's really important to figure out how it can be utilized. So this is a fairly new trend in speech, where it's a core vocabulary and it's a board that provides opportunity to say, I want. And again, you might not be able to have time or to utilize it, but a special education assistant might. And there might be one time within each class where you make sure the student makes a comment or says what they want. Books can provide a great visual on appropriate behavior. Look at all that hand holding and nobody's pulling. So as you're using visuals, go ahead and look at the resources of the book. This is what I was talking about for the young man, where I had this on the back of the piano for one of my self-contained classrooms. And he found it really helpful to look and think about how he was going to handle things. And a final note on that little story is there was a new student in the classroom, and he said, she always has that row line up, and we go to the back, the front, we get all mixed up. And one of the other students sang to him, mumble grumble, you don't have to like it, but it's got to be done. And I realized I use the songs from the music ed curriculum to help teach things and how to handle things. And so this was in the Macmillan second grade book. Can also teach the blues with it, but I also find it as a great opportunity for social skills. So learning in the inclusive setting broadens the repertoire of activities for all of the students. It increases ability to wait and take turns. That spontaneous engagement with peers, passing objects to each other, taking turns, waiting, seeing that kielbasa is coming around and it's going to be that turn. The opportunity to imitate student leaders is really important for our inclusive students. So much of their day is adult directed. That being able to imitate and learn from peers is really important. And then, as we were just talking about, that tolerance for change with flexibility and self-regulation. And then having the inclusive and teaming and that sense of community within the school as students get to know each other. Whoop. Remember, back again, be a detective. Figure out what's going on when there's a behavior or a lack of a skill development, and take it back and reframe and restructure and start from a step and keep building those skills that you're providing your students.